Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Georgina Manok. I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Assessment at Brown University Square Center, the administrative and research home of the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification. I'm joined by my colleague, John Saltmarsh. John, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Georgina. Thanks for organizing this webinar. So I'm John Saltmarsh. I'm a visiting scholar at the Square Center, where I primarily work on the Carnegie classification. And yeah, so it's great to be here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. So for today's conversation, we will address preparations for both first-time applicants and campuses that are reclassifying. That's campuses that received their classification in 2010. So our conversation will include an orientation to both the classification and reclassification frameworks, an overview of the 2020 timeline, strategies that have been effective for successful applicants, and a quick overview of the online portal. Just a few technical information before we begin. Because of the number of participants in the webinar, you will all be muted. Starting now, please add any questions you have using the Q&A function. You'll see Q&A on the bottom of your screen. We will go through as many questions as we can in the time provided, and you can add questions anonymously if you wish. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides on our website. You'll find that on brown.edu/square/Carnegie/resources. For the 2020 cycle, we announced the process in January 2018, and we made the online portal available from May. The applications are due in the portal on April 15th, 2019. Once you submit your applications, the review process will begin, and it will be completed by December 2019, and that's when campuses will be notified. And by January 2020, the classified campuses will be recognized publicly. John?
Great, thanks. So we always start this with saying that the most important thing is to pay attention to how Carnegie defines community engagement, because on some campuses, community engagement can mean a lot of different things. For Carnegie, it means something very specific, and there's sort of two parts of the definition that Carnegie provides, one which is around the process of engagement, that these are reciprocal, mutually beneficial, co-created relationships between community partners and the university, which are really grounded in mutual respect and reciprocity. It's really critical. And so that's what engagement means. And then the second part of the definition on the next slide is just what's the purpose of the engagement? Why are you doing this? And again, from Carnegie's point of view, this is around democratic values, civic responsibility, the civic purposes of higher education, and advancing a public good mission. So again, to stay focused on the definition that Carnegie provides, campuses do a lot of other really great work, which is experiential. It might not be community engaged. They might be doing economic development work, but it might not be community engaged in the sense that Carnegie is defining it. So just be attentive to that as you're putting together your application. Another thing which we just sort of advise you to think about is, and we provide this diagram if it's helpful, to think about there are multiple dimensions of community engagement on a campus. There's sort of the mission dimension, which comes out of sort of the core purposes of the institution. Oftentimes that's tied to strategic planning. There's a partnership dimension in terms of how we relate with community partners. There's the teaching and learning piece. How is this brought into our courses? How does it work in terms of credit? How do we think about our pedagogical practices to improve teaching and learning? And then there's what we might think of as the knowledge production dimension. How does this help advance the production of knowledge on the campus? Keep in mind, we think about sort of core functions of a university being in terms of producing and disseminating knowledge. So community engagement should be tied to those things. And another thing with this diagram is that campuses that get classified actually have evidence in all of these dimensions, which another way to say that is if you have evidence in only some of these and not all of them, it's going to be hard to get classified. So if that's useful, use it. If not, then don't worry about it. But just think about the broad notions of community engagement as an institutional effort, not just a part of the campus. Okay.
So what you're trying to do as a first-time classification applicant is to put forward your best evidence, make your best case, and tell your best story. In this 2020 framework, we've added 2 questions to both classification frameworks that start with you as a campus sharing your own campus context and your community context, which will make it easier for you to craft your narrative and to inform the reviewers of what community engagement context looks like specifically on your own campus. All narrative responses are limited to 500 words. So if you're a first-time applicant, we ask that you do not include links to web pages, as reviewers for the framework will not look at links and you'll be using your space in your response. For reclassification applicants, the documentation framework is designed for an evidence-based reflective process focusing on what has changed since receiving the classification. So the framework here is seeking evidence of how community engagement has become deeper, more pervasive, and better integrated and sustained at your institution. And remember here that the focus is on depth and quality within a sustainable institutional context and not greater quantity per se. So the framework is structured to include narrative responses, allowing for explanation of changes that have occurred since the previous classification. The narratives are designed to address what currently exists, changes since the last classification, and relevant supporting evidence. Wherever requested, please provide links to relevant campus web resources, in addition to evidence provided in the application. So the reviewers may want to examine websites to provide additional clarification and to look for evidence on your online portals. And the reviewers may also ask for a telephone conversation to clarify evidence provided. Some folks have asked when that might take place. We don't have a specific date for when we expect that to happen, but keep on the lookout for any input from the reviewers or any clarification questions. In general, in terms of effective approaches, it's helpful to remember that this is a representation of your institution. It's in many cases, institutions form cross-institutional teams, and this is for your campus as a whole, not part of your campus. So in Brown's application, it's not helpful for us to highlight how great engagement is at the Swearer Center. What we're trying to show is that community engagement is deep and pervasive throughout the whole institution. Don't leave blanks. There's actually space for you, even if the answer is no to some of the questions, to, if you wish, as an optional thing to include any clarification you'd like to include in that answer box. And in general, it would be great if you answer all the questions. Just a note here to think through aspirational plans and concrete plans. So if your answer is no to one of the questions and you say we hope to do that in the future, or we will work on doing that in the future, that won't really be taken into account by the reviewers. But if you actually share concrete next steps towards taking action, or you've actually started working towards a plan and you've completed a step towards that plan, then that's something that could be taken into account. And remember, anything you share in your first time classification will be monitored towards your reclassification. So if you said you had concrete plans to do something, we're going to want to see evidence of that for the next time you reclassify. John?
Great, thanks, Georgina. All right, so I'm going to flip this a little bit in terms of thinking about the review. So from a reviewer's perspective, these are the things that reviewers are thinking about. And I'm going to start by actually answering one of the questions that's already emerged, and encourage you all to keep putting questions up there. So one was sort of, how does the review process take place? So depending on the number of applications, and we won't know that until April 15, there are a set of core reviewers. So in the last cycle, there were 4 core reviewers who read all of the applications. And then based on their read of the application, there essentially are sort of 3 categories. One are the campuses that are clearly classified. One of the campuses that are clearly not able to achieve classification. And then there's a group of campuses in the middle, and those are the ones that we use the National Advisory Council for. You'll see on the SWARE website who's on the National Advisory Committee. And we use those people to help get some additional perspectives on applications that we just need more eyes on them, more thinking about them in terms of whether it actually meets the standards. So that's to answer the question before we just do this piece. So from a reviewer's point of view, this is a holistic review. We're looking at the application as a whole, which means that there's not any one set of questions or any one question which is going to either make or break an application. It's taken as a whole. So if you've got a question and you haven't really addressed that as an activity on the campus, it's not something that you've even thought about doing, and you can't provide any evidence, that doesn't mean that you're going to be unsuccessful. And so don't think about everything has to be perfect here, because it's never going to be perfect. And then the other thing that the reviewers look at in particular are the foundational indicators, and they're foundational for a purpose. They're really at the core of being able to do institutional engagement. So reviewers are going to be looking at those closely. Again, doesn't make or break an application if you don't have evidence for every one of the foundational indicators, but they really are seen as sort of core to any kind of institutional engagement. And then another piece that reviewers look for is a coherent institutional narrative. And where this doesn't work is where reviewers looking at the entire application, and it's really clear that this has been written by 4 or 5 different people. There's sort of a different voice to it. There's a different degree of evidence provided in different sections. It doesn't really hold together very well as a narrative. So just think about that when you're putting together your final application. It might not hurt to have 1 or 2 people sort of pulling together all the final data, all of the final narrative into a coherent whole. All right, go to the next one. And then related to that, these are actually all related to one another, but related to that is this idea of alignment. So reviewers look for alignment across an application. So for instance, if at the very beginning of the application you say community engagement is absolutely core to the mission of this institution, it's in our mission statement, here's the example, and that's terrific. And then a little bit later you get to the question around the strategic plan and the priorities of the institution, and there's nothing there about community engagement, then reviewers are going to start looking and asking the question, how does this align? How, if this is really so core to this institution and it's not in the strategic plan, how is this going to happen on the campus? And we could use a lot of different examples across the application, but just think about the alignment piece as you're putting it together, because reviewers are going to be thinking about that. And then the last one goes back to actually something that Georgina had touched on before, that the classification is given for work that's been implemented, not work that's aspired to. So every once in a while we'll get an application where it's all about, we hope to, we plan to, sometime in the future we will do this, this is what we're planning on, and that's all great. And if you do all of that, you'll probably be in great shape for getting classified in the next cycle, but maybe not for this cycle. So just think about sort of the work that you're doing on your campus and whether you've actually got enough that's implemented to be able to submit an application and be successful.
Great, thanks, John. So I'll quickly walk you through how to access the online portal if you haven't done so already, and what you will find there. So if you go to brown.edu/swear/Carnegie, you will be at sorry, the landing page for the Carnegie classification. And if you click on the 2020 classification, that'll take you to the information about this cycle. So in the very first paragraph on timeline, you'll see applications web portal was launched. You can access it here. So if you click on that link, it should take you to the payment portal. And depending on whether you're first time or reclassification, you'll want to increase the quantity to 1 for whichever is relevant to your campus. Click continue, and then it'll ask you for member information and some billing information. Once you complete that, you will receive an email from notification@giftpulse.com. This might land in your spam, so before you check in with us, maybe you want to check that folder first, or add notification@giftpulse.com to your email list so that it can land in your inbox. So the title, the subject line for the email is new purchase, and it will provide you with a link to start your application in the very first piece of this email. In general, if you want to retrieve the application, you will find it at giftpulse.com/user/surveys. You'll be able to find a link to the classification. This is what the portal looks like. For the reclassification, it'll just say reclassification and have some slightly different information, but for the purpose of this demo, you will find a horizontal menu with the different sections and a vertical menu that will continue with you as you scroll down. On the first overview piece, there's some information about the data provided, the use of data, and the definition. The contact information, for those of you who asked why there isn't a name, because we already have your information from whoever filled the purchase. So we will ask for the title, the institution, and then some information about the applicant. And then for section 1, you'll see this is the campus and community context questions. You'll see, and just like any other question that has a word count under it, you'll have the maximum word count, words limit, which is 500. And then as you write in the box, you will see this number changing, or as you paste in it. So just make sure if you're pasting things from another document to look at the last sentence and make sure that everything you're pasting is going through. And section 2 is the foundational indicators. These are the indicators that are giving us a full overview of your institution. And if you click yes to the multiple choice questions, a follow-up question box will pop up. If you click no, you'll get an optional box to use this space if you wish to explain your answer. Some other sample questions that you will get are questions about numbers, so you can use the arrows or input the number in the box. Some other questions might have checkboxes. So this is a question, for example, on the curricular engagement, and it's asking you to check all that applies. And when you check, you'll actually get a box to include examples. And again, every box has a word count of 500 words. So for those of you who are familiar with the partnership grid in a previous application, we've switched that to a different format. You don't have to provide an Excel sheet anymore. So this is in the partnership section, you will find a survey that will be sent out to partners. A lot of folks are asking when the survey will go out, and that's we've actually made it that you control when it goes out, so that when you add a partner's contact information, it automatically sends them the survey. So you have the questions, and we encourage you to have conversations with your partners about them, and to share those questions with your partners and let them know when you plan on sending that. So when you add a partner, it will prompt you to a series of questions about the partnership and the organization, the contact name, the emails, etc. Some campuses have asked if you have multiple partners on a specific project. What we're asking you here to highlight is just one partner. So if you want to mention more than one organization, you're going to have to pick one contact that will be receiving this survey. And then, as you see here, I just made some sample organizations that I've added as partners. You will see the actions piece on the right, and you will be able to remove or view or edit details for a partner whenever you want. If you have any questions, you can contact us via email at carnegie@brown.edu, but also to the right of the framework, you'll find my picture and my name and the contact box. You can contact us with any questions or anything to troubleshoot. As part of this classification portal, you can also add collaborators. They will be able to edit. So right now we don't have the option of giving differential access to collaborators. So you'll be able to add folks by clicking on add collaborator. You'll be asked to provide their first, last name, and email, and you will also be able to go through actions and remove them if you wish. if you're worried that folks will be editing content and you wouldn't want them to, then we would ask that you probably should share the downloaded PDF, which is right here under the vertical menu. And you can share that with folks for their input. And then the last thing is submitting the application. Please don't click submit if you're not done with all the questions, but this is where you would click submit after you're ready with all the answers. We can go through the questions now, and we definitely invite you to add more questions to the Q&A.
So, Georgina, while you take a look at some of the questions, so let me just ask for a little bit of clarification in terms of what you just said, so that everybody understands. So, once campus submits their application, that's when the partners will be contacted.
So no, so once you add the partner's email, so I'll go back to this step here.
So even before you submit?
Correct. So what we're trying to do is get campus information in time for review, but also have campuses be able to control when this is going to their partners. So if you think you'd rather just keep this till the last thing before you hit submit, then you can do that and they're kind of in sync. But otherwise, if you add a partner, they will be receiving the survey even before you submit the final.
Okay, so that's important to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question, John. All right, so we'll go through the questions one by one, and please add more as you need. So in the tracking, monitoring, and assessment section, can you clarify the difference between these two questions? I'm uncertain what information is being requested and how it is distinctive from one question to the other. So F5.1 says, describe how the institution uses data from the assessment mechanisms. And then F5.1.1 is using examples and information from responses above, provides specific illustrations of how the impact data has been used and for what purposes. So what the first question is asking is, how have you used this information that you've collected? And then for the second one is to provide specific examples and illustrations of how the impact data specifically has been used and for what purposes. John,
yeah, I would just, not to say anything differently than what you just said, Georgina, but the second one is really focused on questions of impact. The first one may be more general in terms of, well, we gather data and then we review it once a year, right? But it doesn't give us a specific example about how you're thinking about what the data tells you about the impacts that you're having. And so that's the difference there.
Yeah, now that you have this information about impact, what exactly are you doing about it, or what changes are you implementing to the programming that you have? So the second question, how will the applications be evaluated? How do you determine how much progress an institution has made? So I think we covered some of the main things that reviewers are looking for in terms of evaluation. In terms of how do you determine how much progress an institution has made? So again, if this is, I'm assuming this is a question about reclassification. So what John had mentioned earlier is that this is pretty contextualized to your campus experience. This is your own campus narrative. So what we're trying to measure is your progress from your last classification and from the commitments you've made. John, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, again, nothing really different. The key with a reclassification application is to provide a narrative of change. So what's changed since your last application? And that's going to look really different for every campus. And it requires you to provide some explanation of why you've done certain things. So for instance, we got a question recently on a campus that in their earlier application, they had a large number, let's say 70 partners that they work with, but now they only have 35. And so they were wondering if that was going to be a problem. And so I said, well, why do you only have 35 now? And they said, well, because we decided that it would make much more sense to work with partners in a much more intensive and intentional way with fewer partners to have greater impact. And so we worked really carefully to limit the number of partnerships that we work with because it helps us do the work better. That's a really good reason to do that. And so it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And they had a really good reason for why that was happening. But that's the narrative that they have, that's the story that you have to tell. So just think about that when you're putting together a reclassification. You're telling a story about change since your last application, and it looks really different for different campuses.
Thanks, John. So for the next question, for questions section 3C21 and 3C31, how do you prefer we share information and scholarly products, in general terms or using specific titles? So what this question is specifically asking, I'm just going to read the actual question for folks so you can follow along. So it says, are there examples of faculty scholarship, including faculty of any employment status associated with their curricular engagement achievement? Yes, no, and then provide a minimum of 5 examples of faculty scholarship from as many disciplines as possible. So what you're trying to do here is to include products on topics specifically related to faculty scholarship of teaching and learning. And for the specific kinds of examples, yes, we want the actual examples of if you have specific titles or what exactly it is that they've produced. So you could mention, I mean, it's only 5, so there's 500 words, will be plenty of space for you to share what exactly it is. So for example, if it's actually a research study, and then the title of the study as well.
And I guess just one other part there too, because Georgina and I were just answering this again the other day, was that there are 2 very different questions. One is around research and scholarship related to teaching and learning tied to community engagement, and the other is around community engaged research. And so there's 2 different questions there. And for some reason, some people don't see that distinction, but that just make sure you understand the difference.
Yep. Do you know when you will be emailing our community partners? We answered that questions. Once you input the community partner contact information and the add partner piece, that email will go out to the partners. For the question on broader impact of research initiatives for federal funding, is this specific category of funding application or a specific element or of NSF, NIH, i.e. are you asking about something very specific, or are overall examples of community engaged research? John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think based on your question here, I would say it is about something very specific. So we want to know whether if there's research going on that's funded by NSF, NIH, CDC, which is being evaluated for its broader impact merit, then we want to know how that work is connected to the community engagement work on the campus. So it's not broader impact in just the general sense of saying it has a broader impact. It's specific to these funding sources.
Great, thanks, John. Please elaborate on foundational indicators. So the classification framework is divided into 4 sections. The first one is your campus and community context. So it's 500 words each to describe each one of these things. And then the foundational indicators is the section of the application that's really trying to get some foundational information about your campus and how community engagement is tied to the key elements of your institution. So the first section within foundational indicators is institutional identity and culture. Is community engagement in your mission? Do you formally recognize it through campus-wide celebrations? And then the second piece is about institutional assessment. Do you aggregate information and use them? Do you have any mechanisms? And then the third piece is your institutional communication. Do you emphasize community engagement in your brand messaging? Does your leadership prioritize community engagement? And then the rest of the pieces are around institutional community relations, your infrastructure and finance, and tracking, monitoring, and assessment. So what this section is really trying to get at is the main foundational information that will get the reviewers an idea of how community engagement is institutionalized on your campus. And then the main section after that is to go through the categories of community engagement and explore how community engagement is tied to your curriculum and to your co-curriculum and to your engagement and outreach efforts and to your partnerships. Could you speak to how examples, projects, efforts are talked about across the framework? Is it okay to refer to different sections that describe a project in a different way? Can exemplars be also discussed in other parts of the framework? Just trying to assess how to ensure comprehensive and non-redundant descriptions of all aspects of efforts we'll be discussing. So I'll start with this answer and then send it over to John. There's several questions that sometimes seem like they're covering similar things, specifically related to assessment, but they're actually trying to capture different elements of your institutional assessment story and different angles that together make up a narrative that make the image complete, basically. So what you're trying to do is to show some of those exemplars throughout the framework, and you're constructing your narrative in a way that shows that answers the framework, but also gives a complete idea of how your institutional engagement looks like. So is it okay to refer to different sections that describe a project in a different way? Yes. And can you discuss the same thing over and over in different ways? Yes, but you also want to be strategic about your use of space and your use of word limits to make sure that you're actually covering as much information, as deep information about your campus as possible. And you're, again, trying to show your institutional story, not a specific part of your campus or a specific center that's doing the work. John?
Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing. I don't have anything to add there. That was really good.
All right, so logistically in GIFPOL, the section that requests community partners looks different from the others. Do we have 500 words for those response boxes too? Correct. For the community partnership questions, when you add partners, the questions will also have 500-word responses. There's some questions around the partnership, who the person, who the contact person is, and some information about describing what this partnership is about, like is it an ongoing partnership? Is this a specific project? And then there's questions around the impact on your institution from this partnership and the impact on the community through this partnership. So all of those questions have 500-word limits. For the foundational indicators, I believe our institution will have to say no to a minority of the questions and will include clear plans for the future. Is there a general percentage of the foundational indicators that need to be solidly institutionalized in order to have a successful application? Are there recommendations on how to address any gaps or opportunities for improvement? For more detail, the main challenge we face is that we are a decentralized university. Again, what this framework is about is your own campus experience, and the context questions in the beginning are important to lay the foundations for the foundational indicators to be taken within a contextualized angle that you're sharing with the reviewers. So there is no general percentage, there is no percent of right answers or wrong answers. What this is specifically looking for is if community engagement is institutionalized on your campus, and your campus might have specific things that are just not relevant or that just won't work in its context, you may just not have NSF or NIH grants, and the question around broader impact may not be relevant for your campus. So in general, there's no right or wrong or specific percentage that we're looking for. John, do you want to say anything else about this?
I'll just pick up and go in a slightly different direction with this. So it asks the question, are there recommendations on how to address any gaps, opportunities for improvement? So the process works in this way. Campuses that are not successful, first of all, that information is not made public by the foundation. So the only way anyone would know that you weren't successful is if you shared that information. And secondly, for the campuses that aren't successful, you're provided an opportunity for a consultation, usually with me, to talk through specifically your application and get feedback on it. In the last cycle, we did somewhere around 40 of those calls. They're typically phone calls, last about an hour. Where we specifically look at your application and give you feedback. We find that that's really helpful in terms of many of those campuses that take seriously that feedback, come back in the next cycle with a successful application. So yes, you will be able to get feedback. And I guess just a slightly different way to think about that is that if you feel like you're putting this together and you feel like, oh, we're never going to get classified, we shouldn't turn this in. If you don't turn it in, then we're not going to know that you weren't successful, and you're not going to be able to get feedback. So you might be better off turning in an application that you know is probably not going to make it, but knowing that you'll get feedback, and that'll help you to move forward in the future.
Great, thanks, John. So there's a question around the differences between Section 2C 2.1 and Section 2C 2.4. Please clarify the difference across questions, budgets, funding, external, internal. I'm assuming this question is about the reclassification, and I will answer accordingly. So 2.1 in funding says, as evidence provided for your earlier classification, you described internal budgetary allocations dedicated to supporting institutional engagement with community. For reclassification, describe what has changed, if anything, with the internal budgetary allocation since the last classification. 2.4 asks, as evidence provided for your earlier classification, you described ways in which the institution invests its financial resources externally in the community for purposes of community engagement and community development. Describe the source of funding, the percentage of campus budget or dollar amounts, and how it is used. Provide relevant links. So these two questions, one is asking you about specific internal allocations dedicated to supporting institutional engagement. And then the 2.4 is asking for the dollars that are actually going to funding or investing in community for purposes of engagement and community development. So not just your community engagement programming, but also community development projects that you might be part of. John, do you want to add anything here?
No, I think that was good. So if you have a center on campus and it has a budget and there's internal money, that's operational money going to that, that's your part of your internal expenditures. If you're working with a community partner and that particular partner has a need for computers, because that's sort of the project that you're working on, and the university actually either takes some of its own computers and donates them, or buys new computers for the community partner, you're investing in that community. And so that's sort of money that's being invested externally. And there's lots of different ways that you could think through sort of how those things could work both internally and externally. But that's the difference there.
Great, thanks, John. The next question is, early framework noted we could obtain a letter from president or provost and could upload, which we did early, but is over 500 words, and now there is not upload options. So we're actually working, I'm gonna work on adding an upload option to that specific question, and it can actually be over 500 words. So stay tuned, we will be updating that shortly.
Yeah, there's no limit on the letter, so we'll fix that.
What if the contact doesn't complete the survey? So this is the first time we're actually piloting the survey to community partners, because we've heard a lot from folks, and we truly believe in giving partners a voice in this process. And we also believe that adding this survey will also prompt campuses to having that conversation with community partners, which is something that is going to be helpful for their relationship. So what if the contact doesn't complete the survey? You're not going to be penalized if a partner doesn't complete the survey. Again, this is the first time we're piloting this, and we're hoping to learn from this process and see what the response rate has been generally. We hope that some partner will be completing the survey, and we believe that if you engage your partners early on in the process, inform them about the Carnegie, share with them the value of what you're working on, and share the questions with them, that will actually increase the completion rate of the survey. Do the partner surveys go out before April 15 or after? We've answered that question already. They go out when you share the emails of the contact person with the partner. Next question, it's my understanding that as soon as we enter a partner's contact information to the partner grid, they will be notified to request input. Is that correct, or are they notified once we finally submit? The first part, they will be notified to request input once you input their contact information. After submission, can we still access the information entered, or will it be closed to us? Good question. I believe you will have access to the information entered, and we'll send you a note once you've submitted, and we'll make sure to clarify that. I'm just going to take
So, Georgina, could you just make a note? Because maybe what we could do is work with GivePulse to have an option where you could, once you've submitted, print a PDF of your application so people could have that.
Definitely. Yeah, I see no issue with why people want to have access to their information. When you input your response, does it save your work as you go, or should you wait to input all your answers when you are ready to submit? So the online portal is set up that it automatically saves. If you have any issue with that feature, please let us know. It should just auto-save. It'll also like pop up a tiny like green saved after you write something. So you should also be getting updates as you write. For faculty and staff, hard to distinguish what you're looking for because the questions are asking the same thing. So I'm going to go back to this section and try to unpack some of the...
Yeah, so while you're doing that, let me just say that we are specifically asking the same question for faculty and staff. So, for instance, there's a question around scholarship. Many staff who work in centers actually do scholarship on community engagement. And we didn't used to ask about that, but that's actually an important scholarly contribution from the institution around community engagement. So we ask it about faculty, and now we also ask it about staff, and it looks exactly the same, except it's asking for a different group of people.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just quickly going to walk through these. Does the institution provide professional development support for faculty in any employment status? That's pretty straightforward. Do you have any professional development opportunities for faculty, whether they're tenured or tenure track or part-time or non-tenure track? In the context of your institution's engagement support services, indicate which of the following services and opportunities are provided. So this is just a checkbox. So if they're offered to faculty from whichever category, you're just basically checking the boxes for these opportunities, but whether it's professional development programs or program grants or research or travel support. And if you said yes to other, you just have to include the other support services. The third question is, does the institution have search or recruitment policies or practices designed specifically to encourage hiring of faculty with expertise in community engagement? Are there institutional level policies for faculty promotion, tenure that specifically reward faculty scholarly work? So for this specific question, we're asking about institution level policies. I think that's where your confusion might be. So that for the next few questions, the differences are around whether it's like the level of the policy. If it's a campus-wide institutional policy for incorporating community engagement into your reward structure, that's one option. And then if it's actually a college or school or departmental level, then that's a different level. It's actually just one department doing this work, or one specific school that has these promotion and tenure and community engagement alignments. And then the other questions are around whether community engagement is rewarded as a form of teaching and learning in general. Again, these are institutional level, whether it's rewarded as a form of research or creative activity, and whether it's rewarded as service. So these first set of questions around like if it is in the institutional level policy, yes or no, and what the information from that is, or if there's anything you want to quote from a faculty handbook. And then the specific questions after that are around, is it like in what form is it rewarded? Is it in teaching and learning? Is it in research or creative activity? And is it in service? And then the second piece of the question is, if it's not on the institutional level, or yes, and are there college, school, or department level policies that have that? And then if yes, what do they represent from the total institution? And you can give us examples. And the last piece on question 9 is if there's a work in progress to revise promotion and tenure guidelines. So again, this could be, yes, this one department is doing some work to revise the promotion and tenure, or this could be the whole institution is doing some work in progress to revise those promotion and tenure questions. So the main difference between these is whether it's institutional level or whether it's in one college, one school, or one department policy. And then the work in progress question could be both. Do you recommend that we develop our application answers in a separate Word file, or is it okay to add responses in the portal? It's up to you, whatever you prefer. If it's easier for you to collaborate in a Word file and then add the responses, you can also, as you add the answers, continue to download the PDF so you have an actual copy of your answers, just in case for backup. Is there a limit to the total number of partners? So we're asking for up to 15. Is there a subsection of the campus that does not have a community engagement piece? Does that, if there is a subsection of the campus that does not have a community engagement piece, does that disqualify the institution as a whole? John, do you want to take that one?
I think it depends, right? This is contextual to your campus. So just to give you an example, a campus might have a college of arts and sciences, a business college, and a law school. The law school isn't part of any of the community engagement activities of the campus. It's all in the business school and the College of Arts and Sciences. So part of the context for that campus is the law school really operates quite independently. So it's not part of sort of the institutional effort around community engagement. And it's deeply in the business school and the College of Arts and Sciences. And so all of our examples come from those two colleges. So that's the context. And then that allows the reviewer to understand why it is that this one section of the university is really involved. But it doesn't mean that community engagement isn't really important to that campus.
Great, thanks, John. If we have several other areas of strong community engagement, such as experiential learning and economic development, should we still include those in our application, even though they aren't specifically listed as a priority to Carnegie? John, do you want to take that one too?
Well, they are there, and so there's a place for you to put that information in. But let's start with the experiential learning piece. What reviewers will look for is that you understand the difference between just an experiential learning opportunity, say an internship, and community engagement. And that they aren't all lumped together into either one definition, or that the numbers that are provided just lump them all together. Because then for the reviewer, they don't really know what those numbers mean or what they're looking at. What reviewers really like is when a campus says, we know what the difference is. Here's how we define community engaged learning experiences. Here's how we define internships. And the numbers that we're providing are only the community engaged learning opportunities, not the internships. Then the reviewer knows exactly what they're looking at, and that the campus has made those distinctions and has implemented those distinctions on the campus. And then the economic development piece of this, there are places to put in information about economic development. We've tried to align the kinds of questions we ask with some of the anchor institution work. It is, as far as the application goes, seen as really important complementary activity on the campus, supporting a larger institutional effort around community engagement. But community development, economic development work on its own is not a substitute for all the other forms of engagement that take place. So, and again, I'll just give you an example from a past application, a campus that used the terminology of community engagement when what they really meant was economic development. So everything was about economic development, which means that it took place in a part of the campus that wasn't tied to the academic work of the campus, wasn't tied to faculty, wasn't tied to student learning. It's not that that's not really important work to do, because it really integrates the campus into the local community in important economic ways. But that's not specifically and singly what the application is looking for. So if that's the way your campus is thinking about community engagement without any of the other components, go back to that diagram we were looking at earlier, it's going to be really hard to be successful with the application.
Thanks, John. Is there a rubric that reviewers use during the review? John?
Yeah, the answer to that is no, there's not. And the history of that is that we've actually tried to develop such a rubric and weren't successful with doing it. I think it's a question of the complexity of the application, and that trying to put that into a rubric framework really doesn't allow for the kinds of nuances that the reviewers want to look at. So no, there isn't a rubric. If there were, we'd give it to you.
We are definitely committed to sharing more information about the review process and a description of how that happens and what reviewers are looking for. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be working on that after the deadline. If a campus is extensively engaged but did not change a great deal since the prior application, does this mean that reclassification is a no? No. John, do you want to word there?
Right. It's all contextual. I think this is also a good opportunity to just recognize that over a 10-year period, there are going to be very few campuses that have a kind of clean, linear story about how their community engagement has advanced. For most campuses, it probably went forward, it went back. There were leadership changes, there were different kinds of commitments, and the work that's going on now reflects all of those kinds of ups and downs. That's the narrative that the reviewers are looking for. We want to know sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and where this is going now and where you're hoping to go in the future. It's not going to be a linear story. We would be really, really surprised to find that it is. And then sort of to the point of the question that was asked here, if a campus was doing extremely high-level work in their last application, and has continued to sustain that work at that high level, that's actually really important. And so you're not going to be penalized for that and say, well, you haven't done even more than all the amazing work that you did before. Hopefully a few things will have changed in terms of how you approach the work, but it really depends on the context of the institution.
Thanks, John. So how do we quickly, easily communicate to those outside of this process how we break down what is community engagement according to the application definition and what is engagement that doesn't count? We have individuals on our campus who think all of our engagement should count for the application and want to build a narrative that argues that point when we know some of it is not community engaged according to the application process, i.e. community partners contracting, paying university faculty to analyze data regarding one of their projects. So, I mean, one helpful way to do that is to actually share the definition and remind folks of the main aspects of the definition. Is it a mutually beneficial relationship? Is it reciprocal? Is the partner at the table when we're designing this process and making some of those decisions? Does the partner have a voice in it? John, do you want to say anything here?
Just that it's actually really important to make those distinctions, and I really can sort of sympathize with this question because I get sort of calls from people who say my president really wants this done, but what I'm trying to do is tell them that this isn't actually the work that we're doing. We might be there in a few years, but it's not. We do great internship programs, but that's not what Carnegie is asking about. And so you can feel like you're in a real bind on the campus. But just as Georgina said, go back to the definition. And it's not to say that all of this other work isn't really important, because it is, but it's not what the classification is about. Another way you could say that on campus is this isn't a classification about internships. And it's a classification on community engagement, and we need to pay attention to how Carnegie defines it.
Great. Could you elaborate on the term systematic assessment, maybe giving an example of assessment that is not systematic?
Sure, so that's an easy one.
Go ahead, John, you're ready.
All right, so here's just like a really basic one. Oftentimes campuses will put together an application and they realize, oh, we need all this data. So they scramble around to get the data for the application. For a first time, that might work, right? But systematic assessment means that you're systematically, on an ongoing basis, with systems in place, gathering data, analyzing that data, and making use of that data to improve practice. So it's not about scrambling to get data together for an application. It's about systems. So that's why the language is always in there about systematic assessment. That's what we want campuses to be aiming for around gathering data around their community engagement work.
Great. How is a community college considered in the application? While we do not have research studies, we do have activities concerning producing reports with community members. Are these taken into consideration in the application? The answer is yes. And then again, the first two questions around your campus and community context are going to be key for you to share the kind of information you'd like the reviewers to know about your community college specifically, and about the types of engagement that you do with community partners. John, do you want to add something here?
No, that's exactly it. Provide the context, and then the reviewers will use that context in terms of looking at the evidence that you provide.
Great. So if planning for a project started in academic year 17-18, but project was not active until academic year 18-19, can we still use it as one of the 15? Yes. So what we're asking for in terms of academic year data, that's actually something we didn't mention. That's a good question. When it comes to academic year data, like courses, like anything that has to do with specific things that are bound to the academic year, it's important to use a full academic year. And the last full academic year that will be available for us is 17-18, because 19 will be in April when you submit. So any data around academic year information needs to be 17-18 academic year. Any data that's actually based on any other engagements that you are doing, a survey that you are working on, then that's something that can go further than the 17-18 time frame. So if the project wasn't active until academic year 18-19, you might be able to use it as year 15. The question will be whether you actually have answers around what the impact on the community is, or what the impact of the institutions is, or like it's good to show that you have growing partnerships, but you will also want to think about whether you'll be able to answer the questions that are included in this in the partnerships question. What are the word limits for stat entry fields on partnership section? So that's 500 words. Do the entry fields accommodate bullet points, indentations, numbers? I think you can add bullet points. I don't think indentations actually works. I don't think you actually have like a bulleted formatting. I can double check.
So just one more thing on that question, Georgina. We want to know when the data that you're providing, when that comes from. That's really the key. So if it's 17-18 data, we want to know that. If it's more recent, we want to know that. For some reason you don't have 17-18 and it's older, we want to know that. It's really important to understand how fresh the data is that you're providing us.
So I have 3 questions. So that's done. Okay, that's done. So I just want to make sure that folks are aware. So it's almost 1, but John and I are going to continue working through these. So if you have any additional questions, we're happy to continue. Is there a question? And if you have a question here that you have to leave at 1, you can just watch the recording. We'll make sure to answer that. Is there a question that allows for a description of the process that the institution followed to complete the application? Is this information useful to provide? So in section 4, all the way to the end, reflections and additional information, there is actually a question that says, reflect on the process of completing this application. What learnings, insights, or unexpected findings developed across the process? So while these questions are optional, we definitely encourage you to provide that information. It's also helpful for you as a campus to, or as a campus committee, whoever was the writing team on this, to actually be reflecting on those questions. Also in the section 4 that's helpful to mention is another set of questions around first using the space to elaborate on any questions that need more space. So if for any reason you felt like 500 words wasn't enough, you can use this section, specify the corresponding section and item number, and use that to elaborate. There's a question around any information that wasn't requested that you consider significant evidence. So that will be helpful for you to share some stuff that are specific to your campus that we were not asked. And number 4 is providing any suggestions or comments you may have on the application process itself. So that would be super helpful for us because in addition to the information we will hope to gather through the application, we will also make a public process for comments available for the 2020 classification and for changes that we will have for the 2025 framework. So while these are optional sets of questions, we definitely encourage you to complete these. Please explain what you're seeking for in this question. As evidence provided for your earlier classification, you described ways in which the institution invests its financial resources externally. So, John, do you want to repeat this a little bit, just in terms of the community engagement and community development external funding?
Yeah, so how does your campus use its own resources and invest those in the community? The example we gave earlier was around buying computers for a community partner because of the project you were working on. It could be ways in which the university invests parts of it in its endowment in the community, right? But these are institutional resources that are being invested external to the institution around community engaged projects. So that's the difference there.
Great, thanks, John. Our funding figures requested supposed to only be from 17-18, correct? That would be a full fiscal year that you will be reporting on. When is the next cycle? So the cycle for the framework is every 5 years. So the next cycle will be for 2025. The framework will be available in 2023 for a deadline of 2024 April, similar to this cycle now. It is wonderful to hear that John will help give feedback to those needing it. Right? Thank you. I missed the letter context. What question asked for a letter from the president? So that's only for reclassification application. So if you're not reclassifying, you don't have to deal with this question. Section about faculty rewards. So there are questions about institution-wide policies, then about colleges, departments, and units. Is this assumption that if you don't have it institution-wide, you will have college-wide, or the reverse, that if you have institution-wide, you may not necessarily have college or department level? In other words, we depend heavily on our institution-wide policies that some departments don't require their own from the institution wide. What would we answer in all department specific questions about citing specific examples? John, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, this is also very contextual. So I would say the most common occurrence is where campuses have institution-wide guidelines that have been revised to incorporate community engagement, but it hasn't gone down to the department level. I can think of very few instances where it's in the department, but not at the institution level. But then there are also campuses, and I think particularly of high research campuses, which are often decentralized to the point where there are no institutional guidelines. They're all in the colleges. So the colleges each have their own guidelines, which then influence the department guidelines. So this is really a contextual question. And in some ways, the most important part of that whole set of questions is the last one, which is you haven't revised your policies, because the expectation is going to be largely, because this is a really hard thing to do, the campuses won't have revised them, particularly across all departments and all colleges and at the institutional level. Then what's happening on the campus to move this process forward? So again, it's going to be really different on different campuses. And very few campuses that will have it at every level where the revision has taken place. So I hope that helps.
Great, thanks, John. What if a community partner does not use email? So we've been asked that question. If it's a partnership you want to choose between the 15 and there is no email, then you can just include that partnership and mention that the partner does not have an email. We don't have a current mechanism to be actually reaching out to 400 to at least like a couple hundred times 15 partners by other means. But if you provide a phone number and we find that it's actually feasible for us to be conducting these surveys, then we can try to accommodate that. But for now, you can just mention that the partner does not use email. Could you elaborate on the difference between 3D1 and 3E2 and 3? So while I try to find those questions, is there I'm just gonna skip to the next one. Is the letter of support available for first-time applicants? No, so only reclassifying campuses have to provide a letter of support. The PDF that one downloads cues formatting. We're working on improving the formatting of the PDF. It looks better when it's more filled, so we're working on improving that. You are asking for examples from all over campus. We have 8 schools within our university. Are you just asking us to provide examples so that all the schools are represented? John, do you want to take that one while I look for it?
That's a good question because it's a lot of data. I think from a reviewer's point of view, the more there are examples and evidence coming from multiple places on the campus, it looks more institutional. Maybe you have 8 schools and they're all doing engagement and you only provide examples from one of the schools. The reviewer is going to be wondering, why are you doing that? Like, why aren't there examples from the other schools? So I would spread it around as much as you can. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about, like, make your best case. And so think about, if you were reviewing this, what would be the best case?
All right, so in the question 3C1, the text of the question refers to staff outputs of co-curricular scholarship, but the blue text mentions curricular and co-curricular. Should we interpret this as both curricular and co-curricular engagement scholarship? Right, I'm gonna look this one up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you should.
Okay, great. Is there a deadline for partners to complete the survey? There isn't a hard deadline. We will send reminder emails at some point, but there's no deadline. Sorry for my second to last question. Oh, good. I'm glad I didn't go to it yet. I meant the difference between 3E3 and 2B1. Let's see. So just to answer the future webinar question, we are offering a webinar next Tuesday as well. So that's another Q&A session. And if you have any other questions, you can just share them with us. Do you have different working definitions for civic engagement versus community engagement? John, do you want to take that one?
No, we don't. We meaning the Carnegie Foundation uses community engagement. It doesn't use the term civic engagement. It doesn't mean that you don't use that term on your campus. The important thing is, what do you mean by it? Right? So if the terminology on your campus is civic engagement, but it has the same characteristics as Carnegie has of community engagement, if I were writing that, I would provide that in the contextual piece at the very beginning. You know, our campus uses this term. Here's what it means on our campus. Here's how it aligns with the Carnegie definition.
The first question is 2B1. It's, does the institution have mechanisms for systematic assessment of community perception? And the second one is 3E2, and that is the partnerships question. So I'm not sure that's the correct questions, because there's nothing in common between these two. So if you want to maybe just actually put what the questions are, and then we can tell you what the difference is between them.
Or Jennifer, just email us off webinar. We'll answer your question.
Is the support letter for both first time and reclass? It's just for reclass. We read this question as an ask for citations. We've listed citations in all 3 sections. Is this not what is needed? For questions 3C21 and 3C31, how do you prefer we share information on scholarly products in general? John?
Yeah, citations are fine. And it could be that the product doesn't really lend itself to an academic citation. So just provide the information that you would normally provide to describe what that product looks like and who did it and what's the title, that kind of thing. What's the date?
Great. Thank you for doing this webinar. It's been very helpful. When can we access your slides and the recording? I would like to share this widely with the team members who haven't been able to participate. So we'll try to put this up by tomorrow. And I can probably try to email all the folks who registered with the link. In reclassifications, do reviewers copy and paste web addresses for those prompts that do not have a place to add a web link? John?
I'm not sure what that question is. Do we
So,
copy?
so some questions have like a enter web link here, like
Right,
a
right,
that,
yeah.
but folks can just add web links to their write-up, correct?
They can.
Yeah. So
If
we
I
will.
were doing it, I wouldn't necessarily use that space for
Mhm.
web links when
Yeah. So
there are specific
it'll go
ones
as
they're
one
asked for.
in the box. So yes, we will be copying and pasting web addresses for prompts that do not have a place. Can you be more specific regarding what distinguishes an internship that is community engaged? For instance, one at a local nonprofit services agency. Does field work in a clinical setting at a healthcare entity qualify? John, do you want to get that?
So I think the question is, who's the partner? What's the relationship with the partner? Is this purely transactional? What's the goal of the partnership? Is it to provide an experience for the students so that they are better professionally prepared and it's not really addressing the needs of the community directly? What's the purpose and what's that relationship look like? So some internships certainly can be community engaged, but this goes back to making those distinctions. And some aren't, and some clinicals could be community engaged, but I think oftentimes aren't. And so it's up to you to sort of figure that out on your campus, how you make these kinds of distinctions. Again, not valuing one or the other, but this classification is community engaged work, not just experiential opportunities.
Thanks, John. I may have missed this earlier, but could you clarify what was said about the amount of community partners that should be in the application? There's a max of 15, but could there be fewer if a campus thought it was strategically more beneficial to highlight a handful that illustrate reciprocal partnerships to community engagement by campus and partners? John, what do you think?
Yeah, it's all contextual. If that's the case, then do that. But I would, if I were the applicant, I would probably use one of those open sections towards the end to explain why it is I didn't provide 15 community partners, but provided 11. Because there's sounds like there's a really good reason for that. But without providing that information, the reviewer won't really know why that wasn't filled out completely.
Thanks, John. So I skipped the question. Sorry. If reclassified, when would the next reclassify? Sorry, if classified, when would the reclassification cycle be? So you get the cycle, so you get the classification for 10 years. So if you get classified or reclassified in 2020, the next, you skip a cycle and the next time you have to reapply would be in 2030. So the framework for that will be available in 2028 and it'll be due in 2029.
So 10 years seems like a long time, but the reality is you're going to start the process after 8 years. And if it were every 5 years, you'd be starting again in 3 years. And so I think for a lot of reasons, it doesn't make sense to ask campuses to go through this process every 3 years.
Yeah. So if social mission, reciprocity, community action, etc., are embedded well into the ethos of the institution, such may not be as explicitly defined as community engagement in documents, policies, etc. Our thoughts about such with respect to answering questions, any thoughts, sorry, about such with answering, to answering questions, re policies when other language is used for such?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I know of campuses where that's the case. I think it's, again, use that context section at the beginning to lay out that kind of ethos that you talk about and how it pervades the institution. And if there's evidence that you want to provide that you can't really provide given the structure of the application because it's focused on something specific called community engagement, that you have a sort of a broader ethos around this, and use those sections at the end to provide that additional information.
Great. I don't think I understand the web link in a text box. How will the hyperlink work? So if you just actually paste the, so for, if you're reclassifying and can use web links, if you paste that into the box, the reviewers will actually be able to take that out and use it as a link. All right, we've answered 58 questions. John, do you have any final thoughts before we close?
No, this was great. Thanks, Georgina, for making this happen. And are you going to post this later today?
Yeah, so I'll post this by today or tomorrow. So
Okay, great.
thank you all for the great questions. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us through the portal or at carnegie@brown.edu. We will post this recording on our Carnegie resources page shortly. As a reminder, this is one of 2 webinars we're offering to institutions submitting a classification application this April. Our second webinar will be next Tuesday, March 19th at the same time. So feel free to register to that if you have any additional questions or ask any of your colleagues who weren't here to register. We will also record the next one, so keep a lookout on our website for those recordings. Thank you, John, for joining me today, and have a great day, everyone. I hope you found this helpful.